So when you have more than one source with the same first author, then you need to use as many authors' names as possible as you need to distinguish between the sources, and then et al. And the date. So you're not listing all the names even then, you're just listing as many as needed to distinguish between the sources. And this will help the readers locate the correct source in the references list. So example, we have two sources with the same first two authors. Source 1, Bradley, Ramirez, Sue, Walsh, and Allen. Source 2, Bradley, Ramirez, Wu, Simpson, and Jones. So citation for source 1 would be, according to Bradley, Ramirez, Sue et al. 2012, cheesecake is delicious. Or as a parenthetical, all at the end, like we talked about earlier. In that case, we got to go to Sue because Bradley and Ramirez are shared first and second authors for both of those two sources. So I hope that makes sense, that that's the one that's going to distinguish that source, so we know we're talking about the 2012 and not the 2000 source. If you want to do it as for the Wu source, it's the same thing. So according to Bradley, Ramirez, Wu et al. 2000, kittens are adorable. Right? So in that case, we're talking about the Wu source, so we go to Wu. We don't need to go any further. We just need to go up to Wu or Sue or whichever one is needed to distinguish between those two. Okay, moving on. The word and versus the ampersand sign. When to use each. So for citations written as part of the sentence, you're always going to use the full word and. You're never going to use the ampersand in the text of an actual sentence. For citations written in parentheses at the end of a sentence, you always use the ampersand. You're never going to put the full word and in a parenthetical citation. Okay, so example, Ogilvy and Brown, 2002, found that blah, blah, blah. And then we have the example of just the parenthetical at the end, blah, 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 Ogilvy, ampersand, Brown, 2002. So if it's part of the sentence, it's full word and. If it's in parentheses as a parenthetical citation, it's the ampersand. Now obviously that's just as APA style goes. That's not if you're using a parenthetical phrase as part of your sentence in parentheses. Then you would use AND. But for parenthetical citations in the text, you're using that ampersand in parentheses. A note on the Oxford comma, sometimes referred to as the serial comma. Oxford comma is a great song by the group Vampire Weekend. But it is also refers to the comma that goes between the second to last item in a list and the word and or the ampersand sign. Okay, so it's the one I've got boldface here. I'll put the cursor on it right here. See where the cursor is? My cursor right now is circling the Oxford or serial commas here. It's the one that goes before the and or the ampersand. All right, and APA does demand the use of the Oxford comma. In grammar, we use the Oxford comma because sometimes the text of a sentence would be confusing without it. And the famous example of that would be if I were to say, I invited my parents, comma, President Obama, and Madeleine Albright to the dinner. Okay, now just think about that for a second. I invited my parents, comma, President Obama, and Madeleine Albright to the dinner. Now, if we don't have an Oxford comma in that sentence, it sounds like I'm saying my parents are President Obama and Madeleine Albright. And they're not. They're Ken and Linda Kurtz. They're delightful people. So, they're not President Obama and they're not Madeleine Albright. And that would be confusing. But if we use our magical little Oxford comma in there, then we've got I invited my parents, comma, President Obama, comma, and Madeleine Albright to the dinner. And now we know that we're just talking about I invited 4 people, and those 4 people were my mom, my dad, President Obama, and Madeleine Albright. So in grammar, it is to clarify individual list items in a series. In terms of APA style, I'm not sure what the reasoning is, but it is a rule, and therefore we must follow it. So here are examples of that Oxford comma. And obviously that only applies to sources with 3 or more authors, because if it's just a 2-author citation, you wouldn't need a comma. What do we do if we have multiple sources by the same author in the same year? Not just the same last name, the same dude or the same dudette. So if we have 2 newspaper articles, both written by John Albert Doe, and both published in 2010, what do we do to distinguish between them? So Article 1, blah blah blah, published in June of 2010. Article 2, doobie-doo-wah, published in May of 2010, both by John Albert Doe. Well, what we do there is we're going to organize our titles alphabetically, and we're going to assign a lowercase letter of the alphabet to each one. So blah 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 comes first alphabetically because B is before D. So that one's going to be lowercase letter A. So that will become Doe 2010A. Doobie-doo-wah becomes Doe 2010B. Easy peasy. And you're going to do that both in the text and in the references list. And that's how you distinguish. You don't need to do that if they're in different years, because then the year is going to distinguish. So this is only necessary when we have 2 sources or more than 2 sources by the same guy or same woman in the same year. All right, so those are the most commonly asked questions about in-text citations. Now let's talk about frequently asked questions and frequently made errors in terms of quotations, and these happen a lot. A long quotation in APA style is defined as 40 words or more, and we treat them as what we call block quotations. A block quotation is used instead of quotation marks, and it is only used for quotes 40 words and longer. The way that you format this is you start the quotation on a new line, so you're rolling along, typing along. You say, according to Doe 2010, comma or colon, we're going to start a new paragraph, a new line, and then we're going to indent each line of our quote approximately ½ an inch from the left margin. You're just going to do this by pressing the tab key once, right? And we're going to put our whole quote in its own little indented block. If the block quote has a new paragraph starting within the quote, then you indent the first line of that new paragraph an extra ½ inch by tabbing over once more. But more often than not, that's not going to happen, and you just have this little block that's indented ½ inch over from everything else, so it stands out. We're doing that instead of quotation marks, not in addition to. And block quotes in APA style are double spaced. So I already covered, don't put quotation marks around it. You're going to cite the source of the quote with your page or paragraph number in parentheses after the ending punctuation mark in the block quote. Or if you cite the source in the sentence that introduces the block quote, as I did in my example a minute ago, according to Doe 2012, then you would only need your page or paragraph number in the parentheses. Okay, so let's see an example of a block quote. Here is an example with its introductory sentence. And note that, and this is one other way in which APA has decided to just make our lives a little bit more complicated, bless them. Unlike other in-text citations, the punctuation for a block quote goes before the parenthetical citation, not after. Why do you do this, APA? Why? I don't know why you give us more things to remember, bless your hearts, but that is the rule. So here's my example. A sentence to introduce your long quotation goes here with a colon at the end, colon, new paragraph, tab over once, start the quote, la la la. I'm giving you an example of a quote that does have a new paragraph starting in it, just so you can see what that looks like. So I'll start my new paragraph, I'll tab over once again, finish my quote, and then I've got my punctuation at the end of the quote, I've got my parenthetical citation, and I'm done. And note, you got a page number in there. When you're quoting, you always have to use a page number. If you don't have a page number, you use a paragraph number instead, and that's simply to make your quote easy for your readers to find. Because my goodness, if you're citing, a 20-page article, how are they supposed to find that thing if you don't give them a page or paragraph number? So throw them a bone, right? So that's what you do with a long quotation. Here is what it would look like if I cited my source in the introductory sentence and I didn't need to put the name and everything in parentheses at the end. So I say, in 2012, Kurt Ogilvy provided instructions for the use of block quotations, colon, block quote, and at the end all I got to do is my page 10. That's a block quote. And that is frequently done incorrectly. The most common mistakes with block quotes are people using quotation marks in addition to the block formatting and people putting the punctuation in the wrong place. But you're not going to make those mistakes now because you just saw my little tutorial. So now let's move on to reference lists, which obviously is the list of sources that goes at the end of your paper. These are often done incorrectly as well. So let's cover some frequently asked questions and frequently made errors. The first line of each citation should be justified all the way to the left, and each subsequent line should be indented. People often do it the other way around, and they indent the first line, but it should look like the example I've got going on right here. Note that references is not bold-faced, it's just plain old text. It's going to be centered. And then we start justified all the way to the left on the first line, and then every subsequent line is indented like that. Take a minute to look at that in all its beauty. You're going to want to refer to your 6th edition handbook or to the Purdue OWL guide for specific types of sources and examples, because let me tell you, man, are there a lot of different types of sources in the world, and APA does have different rules and different types of citation, different order for things to go in, different information you have to put in there for the different types of sources. So I literally would have to do a whole hour-long or longer presentation on just that if I were going to get into that kind of detail here. So I don't think we need to do that. I think you just need to either bookmark these URLs on your computer so that you'll have access to this Purdue OWL guide, or you just need to keep your 6th edition APA handbook close by so that once you run across a source, you can look it up and look up how to cite it specifically. So let's move on to headings and subheadings and the frequently made mistakes there. There are some changes in the 6th edition of APA style from the previous editions, and this is where most of the errors come from because people are used to those older editions. 6th edition APA, the way that you do it is it's by level, the level of heading, and what I mean by the level is, like, let's say you're writing your paper and you have your background and significance as your first section. That's a level 1 heading. That's the main heading for that. Then your next heading might be your methods. Let's say you're writing a research report or a literature review. You've got your methods section. That's also a level 1 heading because it's not a subheading of anything else. It's a major main heading. Now, if within methods you were going to tell us specific things like databases used for a literature review, say, or you were going to do something like that that's a subheading, that's a level 2 heading. Then, if you had a subheading of that heading, getting even more detailed, that's a level 3, and so on and so on and so on. And that's what I mean by levels, okay? Now, I don't even know if I've ever seen a level 4. Like, that's not a common thing to see. But levels 1, 2, and 3 are pretty common. And this is just a simple little chart that shows exactly what to do with each of those headings. Just bookmark it on your computer, find that part in the handbook, and you're golden. Here's some examples to show you. If this were a scientific report following APA style, it would have 3 main sections: methods, results, and discussion. I didn't have time, I didn't have room for all of them, so I just did methods and results. And each of those would start with a level 1 heading. So site of study, that's going to be boldface, it's going to be methods is going to be boldface, it's going to be uppercase, that's our level 1. Our level 2, which is the subheading of level 1, might be something like site of study. And you'll notice that that also is boldfaced, that also is capitalized. That one is going to be justified left, however, whereas the main heading level 1 was centered. The level 3s are going to be indented. They're going to be upper and lowercase, and you can see that underneath results down there where it says test 1. So only the first letter, the first word is going to be capitalized in a level 3 heading. And level 3 heading is going to end in a period. And then, interestingly enough, the first sentence of that paragraph is going to start right after that heading. So it's not going to go on the next line. So there's all these little fiddly rules, and again, you just need to look at